Welcome back to Obscurus Gaming, and today we have a battle of a couple roguelikes that have released for the Switch this year, Have a Nice Death and Death or Treat. I'll be comparing these games across 5 categories that are important for roguelikes: premise, gameplay arc, combat, artistry, and technical performance. Both have been out digitally for a few months, but I tend to wait until the physical release of a game just in case the game is terrible and I can resell it, or if I really like the game, I like adding it to my physical collection. And while these games look very, very similar, one is fantastic and the other is, something I'm probably going to sell, so stay tuned to find out which is which. In Death or Treat, you play as a little ghost named Scary who owns one of the many shops of Hollowtown. The problem is the owner of Faceboo, yes, that's the real name, has ruined the town with their creation of a drug called Storium. It's up to you to venture out to the 4 worlds of Faceboo, Dark Chat, Rip Talk, and Deviltube and destroy all the enemies and restore Hollowtown. As you slowly rebuild your town with candy and other resources, you'll eventually level up enough to take on the final boss. Now in Have a Nice Death, you play as the CEO of Death themselves and the CEO of Death Incorporated, but after some out-of-control employees of yours keep creating a mountain of paperwork, you have to regain control of your company, as the game puts it, the hard way. This is done by taking on the various procedurally generated departments and bosses through combat. Along the way, you'll have a few office assistants to help you in your calls, full of creative office-related humor to keep things as fresh as possible. It creates a wonderfully unique and charming world that really never loses its luster from start to finish. Death or Treat's story starts well, but it becomes bogged down by some uncreative decisions, especially with how things are named, that really feels at odds with the rest of Hollowtown, and the game never really develops beyond that initial premise. Both of these games are slightly formulaic in the sense they stick to what we know and like and maybe don't like about roguelikes, and don't really try to do anything too different, with a couple notable exceptions. In Have a Nice Death, you'll respawn of sorts at the CEO's desk with a recap of your previous run. From here, you can unlock new items for a fee or purchase contracts that might give you small advantages on a future run. As you play, you'll progress from levels 1 through 20, with each level providing a slight benefit. Even with these small bonuses, the game is quite punishing in the fact that there aren't any major perma upgrades to speak of. Your ability to advance farther mostly comes down to how you manage the various unlocks on any given run and your own combat skills. The enemies you kill also release souls, which allow you to purchase curses and other in-run items as you play. Now in Death or Treat, this is pretty much the same thing, except that instead of collecting souls, you're collecting candies. However, on top of this, your progress is also locked behind the gathering of additional resources. For example, early on, killing bats randomly might give you a bat wing you need to upgrade your health, for example. Or maybe you need pumpkin seeds to unlock a new weapon. This is fine, but some items are only unlocked by killing very specific bosses, which felt like the game was artificially inflating its runtime because of this. This is slightly countered by a resource exchange building later on, but ultimately turns the main game into a grind for randomly dropped resources, which isn't all that fun to me. Maybe this is kind of normal for roguelikes since I don't play too many of them, but I didn't like this mechanic at all. Now, because both of these games are action-based roguelikes, you'll be spending like 90% of your time in hack and slash combat, so let's talk about it a little. I'll start with the good, and that's once again in Have a Nice Death. First, your character is just so incredibly responsive and fast as they move and dash through these levels. Some of the best controls for a 2D platforming or 2D action game I've really ever experienced. Second, you have a huge amount of weapons to choose from, well, eventually at least, with 3 different attacks. There's also something called Frenzy Mode, which is unique to every weapon and unleashes a screen-filling power-up that is always fun to experiment with. And finally, the enemies you face have a decent variety, with memorable boss fights to keep you coming back for another run. Now, moving on to Death or Treat, and I know I've mentioned a few slight flaws with the somewhat lazy story and kind of weird game design, but it falters significantly more in combat. At first glance it may look good, but that's about it. The controls are clunky and unresponsive, featuring an even higher amount of repetition than I could expect. Enemies also don't really respond outside of their pre-programmed paths, and difficulty is more about just adding a bunch of the same, somewhat boring enemies to the same section and not really switching up the gameplay formula enough, and that makes the fighting boring. Control-wise, it's also extremely annoying because the dash button only responds after your previous action completes its animation. And it kind of is a good looking animation, but this makes it impossible to quickly dodge attacks from enemies. There is also this weird thing that happens where if you jump consecutively, on the third jump your character needs several frames to properly respond, making for very awkward platforming on top of everything else. Something that will catch your attention for both Death or Treat and Have a Nice Death, if it hasn't already, is their presentation and art. Just one glance at either of these games and I was instantly intrigued by what they were. They both have that spooky, cartoony look that I absolutely love, with awesome contrasting visuals that make everything pop on screen. This, combined with how NPCs move around, and just kind of the art in general, creates an awesome look. Their styles are very similar, like if Tim Burton played Cuphead and wanted to make an action roguelike. Also, the music, while not necessarily memorable, was very fitting for both, and I have no qualms with either games when it comes to the music. I will also give shoutouts to both of the game's opening animations and cinematic as some of the best I've seen for any game I've played all year, instantly making you want to learn about the world they've created. It's just a shame for one game this sets the tone throughout, and the other kind of falls off a cliff. From a technical perspective, I'll again kind of start with the good, and in Have a Nice Death, I actually don't have much to say, because the game is incredibly smooth. Death controls are so responsive, which combined with the visual flourishes and artistry, like when an enemy glows red, it's an indicator that you gotta get out of the way, which I'll talk about in a bit, it makes for such a polished and satisfying game to play. And it has to be running at nearly 60 frames per second. Now in Death or Treat, seconds after the opening cinematic, the game dips in performance immediately. And I don't think it ever came close to even 30 frames per second ever, which, as you might guess for an action game, that's miserable. Because of the choppy performance and weird combat I mentioned earlier, there's actually a giant artificial learning curve. And even when you catch on to how the game plays, which for me took about a half dozen hours to do so, the game crashed. In fact, the very first time I reached the second boss, the game crashed immediately, which, if you know the wonderful feeling when you finally get to the next world in a roguelike, or finally get to that next boss, it was brutal and kinda shot down what little enjoyment I had going for Death or Treat. Now, before we dive into the final category, I want to take a moment and talk about the similar styles of these games, creating a twin films-like experience. For those that don't know, the twin films phenomenon happens when two very similar movies get released at the same time because of production companies catching wind of similar storylines, scripts, or maybe recent real-life trends or events. A good example of this from my childhood is when Shark Tale and Finding Nemo came out at about the same time, which even as a kid I thought was kind of weird and confusing. Movies and games for that matter take years and years to make, so when this happens, it's called a twin film. I've always wondered if this happens in video games too. I don't know if any of you can think of an example of a twin film type experience with video games, because this really feels like it with these two games here. Both are spooky cartoon roguelikes revolving around death with very, very similar styles, and released within weeks of one another, at least digitally, from completely different developers. Who knows, all this could just be a simple coincidence, but just something I thought about during my playthrough. How fun a roguelike game is comes down to how it balances all the previous things I mentioned in this video to create a super addicting gameplay loop that you can't put down. Death or Treat has a fantastic opening, setup, premise, and style, but the experience quickly gets worse from there, and even ignoring the strange and extremely awkward controls, it becomes such a grind of a game. Now, the bones of a good game are here, but the frustrations along the way make this simply a rough draft of a potentially good time, and something you really should avoid at all costs. Sprinkle in the crashes, the super and kind of weirdly low frame rate, and other technical issues as well, and the result is a huge disappointment at best. Have a Nice Death really outpaces Death or Treat in every area that really matters. It does a fantastic job of balancing combat with a larger variety of weapons, choices, environments, and gameplay decisions. Considering the fact the majority of your time with either game will be during combat, Have a Nice Death is such a smooth and responsive experience, not to mention the overall polish and performance are both consistent throughout. And honestly, when it comes to performance, it's some of the best I've seen for any Switch game this year, and it's right up there with some of the polish of games like Hollow Knight and even Cuphead. Have a Nice Death is a game that even modest roguelike fans should play, and it could easily be a contender for some Game of the Year list. Thanks for watching this Battle of the Roguelikes review, everyone. Please subscribe to be notified for more videos just like this one, and I'll catch you next time. Peace out.